The summer heat pressed thick against the windows of Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, on that July day in 1945. Inside the mess hall, the air hung heavy with the smell of strong coffee and something sweeter underneath. 6 Japanese women stood motionless in line, their bodies tense with the kind of fear that comes from years of waiting for the worst. Small paper cups had been placed into their trembling hands, and inside each one sat vanilla ice cream, impossibly white and already beginning to melt at the edges in the warm air. For 18 months, they'd been fed a steady diet of propaganda. American soldiers were demons, the broadcasts assured them. Capture meant torture, rape, slow murder. Their own leaders promised they would die screaming if they fell into enemy hands. Yet here stood a young American sergeant, barely out of his teens, calmly handing them dessert like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. One of the women began to cry. Then another. Within seconds, all 6 were sobbing so hard that the guards stepped back, confused and alarmed by what they were witnessing. But these weren't tears of pain or terror, they were tears of something far more unsettling. The moment when everything you've been taught to believe shatters. The instant you realize the world is fundamentally different than you thought it was. Kiko Tanaka stood in that mess hall line, her entire body rigid with the kind of stillness that came from months of expecting violence. The July heat pressed through the windows thick and foreign. American summer felt different than Japanese summer, louder somehow, full of insect humming and the distant crack of a baseball game the guards played during their breaks. She kept her eyes fixed on the scuffed wooden floor beneath her feet, counting her breaths the way she'd learned during the worst moments on Saipan, when the shelling got so close you could taste metal in the air. The line shuffled forward inch by inch. Ahead of her, Fumiko Sato maintained perfect posture despite 18 months of starvation rations and the kind of exhaustion that lived deep in your bones. The other women pressed close together like birds sensing a coming storm. Sachiko, Yumi, Haruka, and Akane formed a tight knot of shared anxiety and dread. They'd been at the camp for 3 weeks now, long enough to learn the daily routines, but not long enough to stop flinching whenever doors opened suddenly. An American sergeant stood behind a metal table, his uniform crisp despite the oppressive heat. He looked young, maybe 22, with freckles scattered across his sunburned nose. He reached into a box beside him and pulled out small paper cups, white and waxy, each one filled with something pale and already glistening with moisture in the warm air. Kiko's heart hammered against her ribs. Was this a test? Some kind of trap? She'd watched enough propaganda films to understand that Americans were cruel, that they enjoyed humiliating prisoners before the real torture began. Any day now, they'd been told, the masks would drop and the demons would emerge. The sergeant held out a cup to Fumiko with a gentle gesture. "Here you go, ma'am," he said, his voice almost apologetic. Fumiko took it with both hands, her fingers trembling visibly. She stared down at the contents like she'd been handed a live grenade. Ice cream, vanilla ice cream, melting slightly at the edges where it pooled at the bottom of the cup. Kiko received hers next. The cup was shockingly cold against her palms, real cold, the kind that came from ice and electricity in abundance. She hadn't held anything this cold since before the war. Not since the summer her father bought shaved ice from the vendor near the shrine, and she'd laughed as it melted faster than she could eat it. Around her, the other women stood frozen, cups in their hands, none of them moving. The mess hall had gone utterly quiet. American soldiers and staff watched from nearby tables, their conversations dying out as they noticed the strange tableau unfolding before them. 6 Japanese women staring at dessert like it might kill them. Then Fumiko began to cry, not softly or discreetly, but with deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. Yumi followed, then Haruka. Within moments, all 6 of them were weeping, ice cream forgotten in their hands, tears streaming down faces they'd kept so carefully neutral for weeks. Kiko felt her own tears hot on her cheeks, and she couldn't stop them. The propaganda broadcasts had been so consistent, so certain. They'd promised that Americans were monsters, that capture meant rape and torture and death, that the kindest thing an enemy might do was kill you quickly. But demons didn't give you ice cream. She raised the cup to her lips with shaking hands and tasted it. Sweetness exploded across her tongue, so intense it almost hurt. The coldness shocked her mouth. The creaminess, the real vanilla flavor, not the artificial substitute they'd used in Japan when supplies ran low. This was luxury. This was abundance. This was impossible. For just a moment, the barbed wire and guard towers fell away. For just a moment, she was 12 years old again. Her mother braiding her hair before school, her father reading the newspaper in the morning sun. The war, just a rumor adults whispered about when they thought children weren't listening. An American woman in a Red Cross uniform approached, her brown hair pulled back in a practical bun. Concern lined her face as she held out a handkerchief and spoke in heavily accented, broken Japanese. Daijubu, Daijubu, you safe now? Safe. Kiko turned the word over in her mind like a stone she'd found in an unexpected place. Safety. The concept felt foreign, like a language she'd once known but had forgotten how to speak. How could they be safe in enemy hands? How could kindness come from the people they'd been taught to fear more than death itself? But the ice cream was real, the tears were real, and the American woman's eyes held something Kiko hadn't expected to see directed at a Japanese prisoner. Genuine concern that looked deeply, unmistakably human. 3 weeks into captivity, the days had settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal if Kiko didn't think too hard about the barbed wire surrounding everything. Morning roll call at 7, breakfast in the mess hall, work details in the garden behind the barracks, English lessons in the afternoon, dinner at 6, lights out at 10. Structure was a mercy she hadn't expected. It gave her mind something to hold on to, besides the endless questions about what came next and whether her family knew she was alive. Margaret Fletcher watched the Japanese women the way a careful person observes wild animals, with respect for their fear and patience for their skittishness. She'd volunteered for this Red Cross posting 6 months after receiving news of her brother's death. At his funeral, her mother had sobbed into her father's shoulder while telegrams accumulated on the mantel like some horrible trophy. She'd needed to prove something to herself, though she wasn't entirely sure what. That she could look at Japanese faces without seeing the ones who'd killed her brother. That mercy wasn't a betrayal of the dead. She found Kiko in the garden on a Tuesday morning, pulling weeds from around the tomato plants with methodical precision. Margaret had noticed her from the first week, the way she observed everything, the way her English was better than she pretended, the way she seemed to be the bridge between the older women's rigid silence and the younger one's tentative curiosity. Margaret approached slowly, her hands visible and her posture non-threatening. "May I talk with you?" Kiko stood and brushed the dirt from her hands, her face carefully neutral. "Yes," she replied. "Just Margaret is fine," the American woman said. She pulled a folded paper from her pocket. "I wanted to ask if you'd like to write home to your family. The Red Cross can send letters through neutral channels, usually Switzerland. It takes time, but they do get through." Kiko's face went through a series of rapid changes, shock, suspicion, then something that looked like grief collapsing inward. "My family thinks I am dead," she said quietly. "Then tell them you're not," Margaret replied with disarming simplicity. Kiko took the paper with trembling fingers, staring at it like it might disappear before her eyes. "They will not understand," Kiko said. "You don't have to make them understand everything," Margaret said gently. "Just that you're alive. Just that you're okay." But was she okay? Kiko spent 3 days composing the letter, writing and rewriting until the characters blurred together. How did you tell your parents you'd failed to die honorably? How did you explain that the enemy fed you and gave you medicine and treated your wounds? How did you describe eating ice cream while your country burned? She settled on facts. The weather was hot but bearable. She was healthy. They grew vegetables in the garden, daikon and tomatoes and beans. She was learning English. She did not say she was happy because she wasn't sure happiness was allowed. She did not mention the ice cream or Margaret's kindness or the way the American guards showed them photographs of their families back home. Some truths were too complicated to fit into a letter that would be read by censors on both sides. Small kindnesses accumulated like coins in a pocket. Private Wilson, an American guard, showed them pictures of his farm in Iowa, his voice going soft when he talked about his wife and the corn already tall by now, probably ready for harvest. Dr. Walsh treated Fumiko's chronic back pain with hot compresses and aspirin, his hands steady and respectful, never once looking at her like she was something less than human. They received Red Cross packages with soap that smelled like flowers, toothbrushes with real bristles, and chocolate bars wrapped in paper that crinkled. No one struck them. No one screamed. The absence of violence was its own kind of presence, strange and disorienting. But as the others began to soften, Fumiko grew quieter. She refused to speak English beyond the bare minimum required. She picked at American food, eating only rice and vegetables when possible. At night, Kiko heard her whispering to Yumi, "They are making us weak, making us forget who we are. This is strategy. The torture comes later." Kiko wanted to believe her. It would be easier if Fumiko was right, if cruelty was just delayed rather than absent. But Margaret's eyes didn't lie. Dr. Walsh's gentle hands didn't lie. The ice cream that had tasted like childhood didn't lie. She was caught between two truths, and she didn't know which one to believe. The letter arrived on a Thursday in August, forwarded through the Red Cross in Switzerland, passed through a dozen hands across an ocean and a war. Kiko's name was written in her mother's careful script, the characters precise despite the cheap paper and fading ink. Inside, just 7 lines. "We held a funeral for you. Your father will not speak your name, but I am glad you live. Even if you are lost to us, I am glad." Kiko read it 17 times before the words stopped blurring. Her mother was alive. Her mother knew. And somewhere in Japan, in a world Kiko could barely imagine anymore, someone was glad she had survived. Summer bloomed at Camp McCoy with the kind of abundance that felt almost aggressive after years of rationing and scarcity. The vegetable garden became the heart of something unexpected, a place where former enemies worked side by side, their hands in the same soil, their sweat mixing in the same humid air. Kiko found herself looking forward to the morning work details, to the simple mathematics of seeds and water and growth that didn't care about flags or propaganda. Margaret met her there most mornings, arriving with packets of seeds she'd ordered from a catalogue, her excitement over Kentucky Wonder Beans and Big Boy tomatoes genuine and infectious. They developed a friendship built on practical things: the correct depth for planting, the best time to water, whether the cucumber leaves looked healthy or showed signs of blight. It was easier to talk about vegetables than about war. Easier to plan next week's harvest than to think about what came after. The war ended. "My brother Tom was terrible at gardening," Margaret said one morning, her voice carrying the kind of lightness that came from deliberate choice rather than genuine ease. "He could kill a cactus, once planted petunias in full sun in July, and couldn't figure out why they fried." She smiled, but her eyes held something deeper, oceans of unsaid things. He'd been funny, this brother of hers, afraid of spiders, always calling on her to come catch them for him. Kako's hands stilled on the bean trellis she was securing, listening. This was different. Americans were talking about their dead as actual people now, not heroes elevated beyond human weakness, admitting their fears and ordinary foolishness. "He died doing what he believed was right," Margaret said quietly. Her voice dropped when she mentioned Guadalcanal. "I'm angry at what happened, not at you. I have to keep remembering that. The war did this, not you." Those words settled into Keiko's mind like a stone, finding exactly where it belongs in a garden path. Hating what happened, but not the person, separating the system from the people caught inside it, she'd never heard anyone put it that way before, and something fundamental shifted in how she saw the world. Even Fumiko began to soften, though she fought it like someone struggling against drowning. Dr. Walsh approached her back pain with an attention usually given to important people, asking when it hurt most, whether heat soothed it or cold, truly listening to her answers. He'd taught himself Japanese from library books, his accent rough and imperfect, but genuine in effort. "Pain is pain," he told her in careful, broken Japanese. "Suffering is suffering. It doesn't carry a flag on it." Fumiko cried then, turning away, but she came back for treatment the next day, and the day after that, and her tense shoulders slowly began to relax. A small smile appeared on her face once, brief and quickly gone, but Kako witnessed it and felt hope spark in her chest like a bird testing its wings for the first time. The days began to feel different. Sachiko taught Private Wilson how to make onigiri, laughing at his clumsy attempts to shape the rice, his large hands too rough for the delicate work. The Americans shared their baseball games, trying to explain the rules while the Japanese women watched with polite bewilderment. One evening, someone brought out a record player and swing music drifted into the warm air, strange and beautiful and completely foreign. They all sat together on a Wednesday evening with watermelon, juice running down chins, seeds scattered in the grass with unself-conscious joy like children. Sachiko laughed first, open and unguarded. Then Yumi joined in, and suddenly everyone was laughing together. Americans and Japanese side by side, and for that moment the war seemed like something happening somewhere else, somewhere far away. Word came through camp that Germany had surrendered. The European fighting was finished. Hope arrived with it, fragile and hesitant, but undeniable. Perhaps Japan would surrender too, perhaps this terrible time would finally end. Perhaps they could all go home. Kiko let herself imagine it for the first time, going back to her village, seeing her mother again, working as a nurse in a hospital where injuries came from accidents instead of war. A life without barbed wire fences, without guards watching constantly, without that endless low fear humming through everything. The possibility felt both impossibly far away and suddenly terrifyingly near. Late July brought fireflies dancing like stars that had fallen to earth. Kiko sat at a garden bench, watching them flicker through the tomato plants, their light soft and steady. Margaret sat beside her, both of them silent, just breathing air thick with growing things and something like hope. "Whatever comes next," Margaret finally said, "I won't forget you. You're not my enemy. You're my friend." Kiko looked at her, really looked at this woman who'd lost her brother yet still chose kindness, who brought seed packets and attempted Japanese, who refused to let hatred win. "I'll remember you too," Kiko said. In that moment, sitting in a garden enclosed by barbed wire, with fireflies writing light across the darkness, she believed friendship could overcome war. Then news came in pieces. Rumors passed between guards, whispers that didn't make sense until they formed something too terrible to comprehend. August 6, 1945. A single bomb had destroyed Hiroshima, not just damaged it, destroyed it, erased it. The Americans used terms like atomic and unprecedented, but the Japanese women heard only gone. Everyone, nothing remains. Kiko gripped the edge of her bunk so hard, her knuckles turned white. Her village sat 30 miles from Hiroshima, close enough that her father sometimes took the train there, close enough that the light would have been visible from their fields, close enough that the numbers made terrible sense. 3 days later came Nagasaki. Then the Emperor's voice on the radio, thin and crackling and unmistakably defeated, announcing Japan's surrender. The war was over, the world upside down. Victory for her captors meant destruction for her people. The Americans in the mess hall cheered and embraced, some crying with relief. The Japanese women sat in silence so complete, the air itself seemed dead. Kiko stopped eating. Food tasted like ash now, like betrayal, like every act of kindness had been a way to lower her guard while her country burned. While she'd been planting tomatoes and learning English and laughing at baseball games, American planes had been carrying the sun itself to drop on her people. The ice cream that had tasted like mercy now felt like poison she'd willingly swallowed. Margaret tried to reach her, bringing soup that went cold, speaking gentle words that shattered against walls Kiko didn't know she could rebuild. How do you comfort someone whose world has ended? How do you say I'm sorry when your side just incinerated 2 cities full of people who looked like the person sitting in front of you? Fumiko retreated into a silence deeper than before, moving through camp like a phantom, her eyes focused on something no one else could see. Even de Walsh's careful attention couldn't penetrate whatever fortress she'd built around herself. They found her Tuesday evening, hanging from a rafter in the barracks, her body swaying slightly, her face already turning blue. Yumi's scream brought everyone running. Dr. Walsh cut her down, his hands moving on pure medical instinct, performing CPR with fierce focus while Kiko and Margaret held the others back. He breathed life back into lungs that wanted to quit, pushed rhythm back into a heart that wanted to stop. Fumiko woke, gasping, then screaming, raw Japanese words needing no translation. Why? Why didn't you let me die? We have no honor left, no home, there's nothing left, don't you understand? Dr. Walsh held her while she fought him, his voice steady and low. There's this. There's now, there's tomorrow, that's something. But it didn't feel like something, it felt like cruelty. Surviving the war only to learn survival had cost apocalypse. The camp fell into a mourning without ritual or shape. Some American guards celebrated with whiskey and backslapping. A drunk young soldier made a joke Kiko overheard through the mess hall door. Something about Jap barbecue that made his friends laugh nervously. Margaret turned on him with fury Kiko had never seen, her voice cutting through like a blade. Get out right now. The damage was done. Standing in the doorway, when Kiko and Margaret's eyes met, everything built between them crumbled like paper. You are still them, Kiko said flatly. I am still us. Nothing changed. She walked away before Margaret could respond, before the tears in Margaret's eyes could make her feel anything but the vast emptiness where her homeland used to be. That night, a Red Cross package arrived with Kiko's name, soap and chocolate, and a letter from Margaret asking about her favorite flowers. Kiko left it unopened on her bunk. She stopped going to the garden. The tomatoes ripened and rotted on their vines. The beans dried to brown husks. Summer's brief truce withered in atomic fire, and kindness that had seemed revolutionary now felt like a child's game played, while the real world burned. September came with cooler air and the machinery of repatriation beginning. The women would be transported on ships, processed through camps in the Philippines, then delivered to whatever remained of Japan. Home, the word had lost meaning, become abstract. What was there to return to? Rubble. Refugee camps, a country that had lost everything, including the ability to feed itself. Kiko volunteered for the first transport. She couldn't stay here anymore, couldn't keep pretending kindness mattered when kindness hadn't stopped the bombs. She packed her few things, clothes from the Red Cross, a letter from her mother, a bar of soap she'd been saving, and deliberately left Margaret's unopened package on the bunk. Some doors, once closed, needed to stay that way. The night before departure, Dr. Walsh called her to the infirmary. Her hand shook as she walked there, old fears surfacing. Was this finally it? The punishment, the violence promised all along, just delayed until the end. Instead, Dr. Walsh sat at his desk, looking older than his years, and held out a telegram. This came through the Red Cross network today, from Japan. Kiko took it with numb fingers. The paper was thin, the typing uneven. A survivors' list from refugee camps forming outside Hiroshima. She scanned names meaning nothing until she found it. Tanaka Hana, her mother, alive, living in a camp near the ruins. The letter her mother had sent about the funeral, her father's silence, had been written 2 weeks before the bomb. Before everything ended, before everything somehow continued anyway. Kiko's knees buckled. Dr. Walsh caught her, guided her to a chair, his hands steady on her shoulders, the way they'd been steady when he breathed life back into Fumiko's lungs. She's waiting for you, he said in careful Japanese. Your mother wants you home. The words cracked something frozen in Kiko's chest since August 6th. Her mother was alive somewhere in the ashes and aftermath. Her mother was alive and waiting. The future wasn't just absence and loss. It was also possibility, however small, however damaged. That night she found herself in the garden, drawn by habit and something deeper. Margaret was there too, alone in the moonlight, pulling weeds though the season was ending, though everything they'd planted was dying or dead. She looked up as Kiko approached, her face carefully neutral, braced for more rejection. My mother lives, Kiko said in English, the words coming easier now after months of practice. Margaret's face transformed with relief and joy, and something like vindication flooding across it. They stood looking at each other across the small space that felt like an ocean. I was wrong, Kiko continued, the admission like pulling shrapnel from a wound. Something did change. Not the war, not the countries, but me, you, us. They cried together then. Not the broken sobs of the ice cream day or the hollow grief of Hiroshima, but something cleaner, something that held both pain and possibility. Margaret pulled an envelope from her pocket, small and worn from being carried close. "Seeds," she said, pressing them into Kiko's hands. "From our garden, tomatoes, beans, wildflowers. Plant these where you're going. Grow something. Remember that enemies can become friends. Teach your children this." The morning of departure, all 6 women gathered with their small bags and borrowed clothes. Fumiko stood there too, thin and marked by her ordeal, but standing, present. Dr. Walsh had shown her that survival wasn't shame, but resistance, that living despite everything was the most powerful choice she could make. The American staff lined up to say goodbye, not as victors and defeated, but as people who'd shared a strange summer of ice cream and gardens and learning each other's languages. Margaret gave each woman a chocolate bar for the journey. When she reached Kiko, she also handed her a letter. "Don't read it until you're home," she said. They embraced, quick and fierce and impermissible and absolutely necessary. Then Kiko climbed onto the truck that would take them to the train, to the ship, across an ocean to whatever remained. She stood on the transport deck as California's coast disappeared into morning fog. The other women stood beside her, all watching America fade away. Kiko opened Margaret's letter, her hand steady now. "Dear Kiko, you taught me that the opposite of enemy isn't friend, it's person. Thank you for being brave enough to survive. Thank you for the garden. I'll keep planting. I hope you do too. We don't get to choose what happens to us, but we can choose what we grow from it. Your friend across the ocean, Margaret." Kiko looked at her fellow survivors, these women who were supposed to die, who ate ice cream and cried, who planted gardens and learned English, who survived not despite mercy but because of it. She reached into her bag and pulled out the envelope of seeds Margaret had given her. She'd plant them in the ash soil of her ruined homeland. She'd teach her mother the English word for dignity. She'd tell the story of the summer when enemies gave her ice cream, and it tasted like the future. Kiko took out the notebook Dr. Walsh had given her and began to write. Not propaganda, not orders, but truth. This is what they never told us. Mercy is real, kindness crosses borders, and ice cream, impossibly, can save a life.